Hey, what's up, guys? Time for one of the most beautiful games I've seen so far. It's about a guy who's, in my opinion, absolutely the best King's Indian player ever. You may like him or you may not, but his King's Indian games are so good. For example, I've seen so many good King's Indian games by so many good players, including Kasparov, Judith Polgar, Robert James Fischer. Almost all these guys played King's Indian. But Nakamura's games, with all those sacrifices, simply he doesn't care about the pieces. That's something that this game is going to be full with. And you're just going to be more than confused what was happening in this game. Wesley Saw, American champion, was white. Hikaru Nakamura was black. The game took its place in Sinkfield Cup, St. Louis, 2015. Wesley went for d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and Nakamura went for bishop g7. You all know how much we like on this channel King's Indian. We even have that live lecture. Hopefully this is going to give you like additional love for this opening, and even after this lesson and even after this video you're gonna enjoy King's Indian experience even more. So after e4, Nakamura plays d6 to anticipate e5 idea, knight f3 castles, bishop e2, and e5. For all of you who are unfamiliar with the King's Indian ideas, it's the main line against the King's Indian, the most common one in the practice, and here a black just goes with e5, breaking in the center. They can't take on e5, because if they take on e5 and play rook to d8, it's exchanged variation, you just go with a rook on e8. If they play Petrosian's line, you play a5, and no matter what happens, you just go with knight a6, queen e8, bishop d7, and so on. And finally, if they play Gligorich line, you just go with the knight g4, chasing that bishop away, play f6, and go with knight d7, knight c6, g5, h5, or whatever you like to do here. For example, like this, and then you just play h5, and so on. In this game, Wesley went for castle. Nakamura played knight c6, and here we have an open invitation for one of the most exciting games in King's Indian, and that's why all of us who play King's Indian, that's what we all expect to play with the black pieces. Just like when you play the dragon and you expect Yugoslav variation and attack on the queen side, here you just go with the knight c6 and you just want to have Mar del Plata variation found by Gligorich in famous Mar del Plata city. After d5, knight e7, knight e1. That's just one of the options. Nowadays, all together with the knight e1, which is definitely one of the main systems against King's Indian. Another very interesting and very, very promising for white is bayonet attack with b4. If you really want to see what Naka did to these guys, you can just check the games where he played against Gelfand, where he played against Belavsky, and where he played one more game, Wishy Anand, and he just killed his guys with the black pieces. You cannot even imagine which one was more beautiful. So after knight e1, we have a typical continuation that goes with the main line of the Mar del Plata. This knight goes on e1 because it goes on d3 at some point and wants to support c5, while at the same time, whenever you place your knight on d7, and I constantly keep explaining to my students, you gotta play knight d7 because you want to break with f5, but at the same time, when sometimes they want to go with c5 to be able to recapture by the knight on c5. So that's the thing. So they won't be able to play c5 just like that. Wesley played f3, Nakamura played f5, bishop e3, Naka went for f4. Closing the center is one of the main concepts of the Mar del Plata system, because when the center is closed by d5 by white, then you can close the center with f4 and then launch the pawn storm on the king side. For example, similar to this Mar del Plata ideas, you can see in many different type of games, including even Rai Lopez, including so many different kinds of positions. And when you learn those type of concepts, you can apply them successfully in different openings. So I really think that this bishop e3 is the most popular and absolutely the most promising as well continuation for white against the King's Indian. What I like about this variation for black is that it always gives us g5, g4, and the famous pawn sack with g3 at proper moment. Nakamura played g5. Wesley So played knight to d3 in order to support pawn push with c5. Naka went for knight g6, c5, and knight f6. That's a very important maneuvering with these knights, and he's just once again repositioning these knights in order to get himself ready for the kingside attack. So after like rook c1, this is one of a once again crucial moments for a good understanding of this line, because white is willing to take on d6 and to go with the knight b5. By jumping on b5, whoever jumps with a knight on b5 and afterwards jumps on c7, and you allow them to afterwards go with the knight e6, you simply can... It's like signing the death penalty and giving the full point to your opponent. Because if they go with the knight c7 and knight a6, light square bishop doesn't support anymore the kingside attack, and you can't count on anything more than, you know, just how to fill like a little bit more moves on your score sheet. Definitely the result is known. White is gonna win there. So after like rook c1, it's very important part of the Mar del Plata is to play rook on f7. The point is, your rook on f7 controls the 7th rank, controls the c7 square. So all these ideas coped with c takes and knight b5 now simply doesn't seem to be working, because he's not threatening to jump, since this rook is just controlling this. From another point of view, he's just having bishop and this pawn, but we're not afraid for the pawn on a7, and many times you can just give up this pawn, but what you never supposed to give up, it's the light square bishop. So when they take like knight a7, you gotta play bishop d7. But you don't play bishop d7 here if that's gonna give them knight c7 followed by knight e6. No, they're not interested in the rook on a8. They're interested in installing that knight on e6, disconnecting the light square bishop and its activity afterwards on the king's side, and that just gives an easy game to white afterwards. So when he plays rook f7, he doesn't only prevent this typical queenside expansion by white on the queen side, but at the same time, he's just releasing the f8 square for the bishop that is going to control and overprotect the d6 pawns once they take on d6. But on top of all that, he just wants to go with the rook on g7, and by playing h5, g4, eventually break with g3. Yes, you heard me well, you don't want to take on f3, but you want to break with g3, and that's why I consider this variation with bishop e3 and bishop f2 pretty good for black, because if you manage somehow to do a g4 and g3, it's like 50% of the game is done. So Wesley went for king h1. An idea of king h1 is purely defensive. He just wants to have once you play h5, and that's what Nakamura did. So once he plays something like this, he just wants to have a very nice defensive resource bishop g1, and that's a very important thing. Once you take on h2, they won't take by king or by bishop. They will put the bishop back on f2. Queen wouldn't be able to penetrate afterwards, and you might have lots of problems. Nakamura played h5. Wesley So captured and played knight b5. Here we're talking about possibility to go with g4 followed by g3, and in which case he would give up a pawn on a7, or just to do something a little bit unusual for these positions and not to even worry about the pawn on a7, and that's what Nakamura did. He played a6. It's a standard type of idea of basically preventing white's actions on the queen side with a6, but it's at the same time weakening of the queen side, weakening of the pawn structure, and in a way giving white maybe just an easier and just faster time in order to somehow break on the queen side. After knight a3, now he just wants to go knight c4 and knight b6. I once again have to repeat, if you lose the light square bishop, you give up on your attack and you give up on your game. That's why a6 pretty much forces the next move, and it's b5. Now you have those two pawns, and now they prevent knight c4. The knight cannot enter the game, and now they have two options. Wesley So went for rook c6. Pressures the pawn on d6, gives some bishop b6 at some point, wants to play queen c2 and tripling his pieces on the c file. But rook on c6 stands there pretty unhappily. From another point of view, there is a possibility that some guys like to do knight b4. Looks really awesome to place your knight on c6. Looks like almost in the heart of the black's game. But I just have to make happy King's Indian players and to say it's gonna, like it's not going to give them anything but just a nice square for that piece. And all we have to do, we just go with g4. So when they play knight c6, we should be going with some queen f8, queen e8, queen d7. I like queen f8 or I like queen d7 in these positions. And I'm just ready to carry on with my attack. Well, the knight stands really, for example, queen f8, stands really nicely here, but it doesn't do basically anything. So that's why Wesley played rook c6 to support bishop e6, to have queen c2 followed by rook c1, tripling those pieces and creating some sort of pressure against the d6 pawn and bishop on c8. Nakamura plays g4 and prepares himself for some break with g3. Wesley played queen c2, Nakamura plays queen f8. This move will turn out to be one of the decisive moves in the whole game. And the concept of queen f8, to me, when I first look at this game, wasn't that, new. I knew about this queen f8, but I saw it in famous game between Korchnoi and Kasparov. In that game, Kasparov went with some g3, then he went bishop h6, bishop g5, queen h6. That wasn't the point in this game. He actually had something. He had something up his sleeve way, way, way better and way more attractive. Rook c1 threatens to take famous light square bishop in the King's Indian and bishop d7. No, don't think that you came to d7 because you want to take this bishop. No, that is just going to give them and buy them a precious time. We didn't come there to do that. Actually, we're not going to do that. We just came here and we want to keep the light square bishop for the rest of the game. Wesley So played rook c7 and Nakamura plays bishop h6. You know what? He's just made a decision to place this bishop on h6 and to slowly start threatening some g3 ideas, in which case, if Wesley captures, he's going to have some problems in some variations at some moments with the rook on c1. But just like you like your light square bishop and you don't want to give it up for the rook on c6, here the dark square bishop doesn't have to necessarily be given for the rook on c1. Bishop e1 softens up the idea of g3 and anticipates that plan very much. Nakamura goes with h4. He now wants to push these pawns and he wants to play h3, breaking this pawn structure around the king. For the first time in this game, we gotta see the shaky nature of the white's king. Probably Wesley So had this in mind, and probably he thought if h4 happens, I'm gonna capture, and that's what he did. But he certainly didn't count on what's gonna happen in the next 14 moves. So get yourself ready, fasten your seat belts, and take a look at one of the most spectacular King's Indian games ever played. Nakamura plays f3. Since we're analyzing his game, and since we're analyzing the King's Indian, and since we all know how much he liked to draw these arrows on the boards, that's what I'm doing here with this f3 move. So Bishop on h6 threatens the rook on c1. But it's not about that. It's about opening up that diagonal and, more importantly, taking into account a strong activity of the rook on f7 and queen on f8. And you know that the line and the rook and the queen are always the best when the queen is behind the rook. So you just have to start taking very much and paying very much attention on the open f file here. After g takes f3, Wesley was he was having like a good control of the c file on the queen side, and now he's up to pawns. Don't forget, both of these pawns Nakamura sacrificed. He didn't blunder them. So he plays knight takes e4. After he sacrificed 2 pawns, he now sacrifices knight. And in the case of f takes e4, he would have gone with rook f1. A beautiful mating pattern, because if you take, he would come up with queen f1, which is checkmate. But that's not a problem. Point is, what would happen if the guy just comes to g2, because there are like 2 bishops, and this rook and queen can no longer go on any of these squares. So look at this. This looks kind of difficult. But then bishop to e3. That's why I told you that in many of these positions, it turns out that it's way better to keep the dark square bishop instead of just being greedy and taking on c1. After bishop f1, he sacrifices, after he sacrificed 2 pawns, knight, rook. Now he sacrifices 3rd pawn, gives check, and after this would deliver checkmate. That didn't happen in the game, and Wesley saw after knight e4 plays rook to d1. Why rook to d1? He just defends his rook, thinking like at some point he might want to take on c1 and to play I don't know what, and to go into a better middle game. But Nakamura he was on top of his task in this game and plays rook takes f3. After he sacrificed 2 pawns, knight, he now sacrifices a rook. Unfortunately for white, they cannot capture here at f3 because of queen f3, and after queen g2, bishop g4. Threatens to take the rook on d1, threatens to take to play, for example, queen f5 followed by bishop f3 or bishop h3, and so many other type of tricks here. White went for rook takes d7. Don't forget, even though he sacrificed the knight and rook, his bishop is even hanging here. So Wesley saw captured on d7, and at the moment he was up a piece and 2 pawns. This guy goes with rook f1 because by now we already know that this is mate. But of course Wesley plays king g2. Nakamura plays bishop to e3, and it's quite interesting. What was he actually threatening here? Let's imagine they just go with something. For example, let's say they go queen c7. You just go with rook g1, but you also have that famous h3 following and followed by this, and you can just go with even this one is a nice mate. Sorry, I actually apologize. It's way better to go with something else. So rook to g1, but the critical thing is he can hide here, and then he's got this knight that is going to keep an eye. Although now you just have knight g5 checkmate. So all these variations just work very successful in this variation, and he went with the bishop g3. Nice, pretty nice and pretty unexpected way of trying to defend himself, because he's connecting the rook on d1 and wants to take this rook on f1. It looks like he found a way to defend himself. But now Nakamura, once again on top of his task, he takes the bishop and sacrifices the rook. After rook f1, goes with the knight h4, has to go king h3. If the king goes to here, it's checkmate by g2 pawn. And after king h3, he goes queen h6. At the moment, he just wants to jump off with the knight somewhere, followed by queen h2 with a checkmate. Wesley plays g5, which is going to open him up very important defensive square g4. So all of a sudden, there are some very nice ways for white king to, like simply walk out of these mating patterns, and position is becoming a little bit shaky, of course, for everyone else but Nakamura, because he saw what was gonna happen here. He captured by knight, and after king g4, plays another amazing move, knight h to f3. By playing knight to h to f3, this king that is walking on a thin ice and that is just going for a moonwalk here, he's threatening queen h4. So he can't take. He can't take because the mate was inevitable. And the thing is, he just went with the knight on f2. He also is ready to sacrifice, to give some check at some point if you move the queen. Although the thing is, bishop f3 would just go into queen h3 and it's checkmate. So many nice mating patterns. So Wesley plays knight f2, prevents queen h3, and also opens up queen for some counter-attacking chances. Nakamura came up with queen h4, Wesley plays queen f5, and plays rook f8. This is an interesting way of fighting and playing with this king. And look at this, king on g6 seems almost untouchable, and I believe that during the game, they both had, in some moments during the game, some phantoms, and probably they were a little bit scared what might happen and not to blunder something, because the game is full of pieces and full of crazy sacrifices. But here Nakamura once again shows why he's by far the best tactical player in the world at the moment, if not of all times. So he goes with a rook f6. He gives up this rook, forces the king to take, and now he comes up with a double check. This is a beautiful double check for the king. King cannot come here because of this mate, and king went to g6, and this was amazing, mind-blowing finish and attack by black. That's why I like this game so much. I really think it's one of the best King's Indian games ever, if not the best ever. But if there is a candidate to this game, it's also from the game Gelfand Nakamura, where Nakamura destroyed that guy as well. Amazing game, fantastic sacrifices, lots of very typical King's Indian Mar del Plata ideas, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much and wish you lots of luck with King's Indian. Bye bye.